The copper-haired woman pressed the forked willow branch between her palms and stared Bernard Finley dead in the eye, and the look she gave him was not the look of a woman who needed saving. It was the look of a woman who had already decided whether or not he was worth her time, and the jury was still deliberating. "You rode 4 days across open country to stand in my yard and tell me what I already know," Mamie Ellsworth said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had been underestimated so many times that the offense no longer even registered as an insult. "Caleb Drum and his riders are moving stolen government payroll across the Sonora basin. 6 men are dead. 2 of them were mine." Bernard felt the last 2 words hit him like the flat of a rifle stock against the chest. He had not known that. The sheriff in Tucson had not told him that. Nobody had told him that, and he stood in the blazing September heat of 1882 outside a low adobe house 15 miles from nowhere in the Arizona Territory and recalculated everything he thought he understood about this situation. "Yours," he said. "My hired hands," Mamie said. Tomas and a boy named Eli Beaufort, who was 19 years old and had never done a single thing wrong in his life. She set the dowsing rod down on the porch railing with a deliberate, controlled gentleness that somehow communicated more fury than if she had thrown it. "So when you come to my door and tell me you need a guide through the Sonora because you're chasing Drum, Marshal, you need to understand something with great clarity before you say another word. I am not doing this for the United States government. I am not doing this for your badge. I am doing this because those are my dead, and I intend to see the man who made them that way put in the ground or behind iron bars. You are welcome to ride along." Bernard Finley had been a United States Marshal for 9 years. He had ridden into more dangerous situations than a reasonable man would ever agree to describe in polite company. He had faced down claim jumpers and cattle rustlers and men whose names appeared on federal wanted circulars in 7 different territories. He was 34 years old and had the kind of face that sun and wind and a certain variety of hard living had sculpted into something that people tended to remember. He was not, as a rule, speechless. But standing in front of Mamie Ellsworth on that September morning in the Arizona Territory, with her copper hair pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and fierce intelligence, and a pair of green eyes that seemed to be actively cataloging and evaluating everything about him, he found he had absolutely nothing to say. He had expected a woman who would need convincing. He had expected reluctance. He had expected, if he was being brutally honest with himself, the kind of soft-spoken, nervous cooperation that most people displayed when a federal marshal arrived at their door. He had gotten none of that. What he had gotten was a woman who was already several moves ahead of him on a board he had only just sat down at. "All right," Bernard said finally, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Tell me your terms." The ghost of something crossed Mamie's face, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that he had passed some initial test she had not told him he was taking. "My terms are simple. I lead, you follow. When I tell you to stop, you stop. When I tell you to move, you move. I do not take orders from men who do not understand the desert, and you, Marshal, do not understand the desert." "I've ridden the Sonora before," Bernard said, and he knew even as he said it that it was the wrong thing. Mamie looked at him with the patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a person who had been confidently wrong about it for a long time. "Riding through it is not the same as knowing it. Any mule can cross a desert. Knowing where the water is, knowing how it moves underground, knowing which arroyos will fill in the afternoon storms and which ridgelines will kill your horses before dark, that is something else entirely. That is what I do, Marshal. That is why you are standing in my yard." She was right. He knew she was right. The sheriff in Tucson had been very direct about it. If Bernard wanted to cut through the Sonora Basin fast enough to intercept Caleb Drum before he crossed into Mexico and disappeared into the Sierra Matter with $40,000 in government payroll, there was exactly one person who knew that route well enough to keep him and his horses alive, and her name was Mamie Ellsworth. He just had not expected her to be like this. To understand why Bernard Finley had ridden those 4 days through open country to a low adobe house 15 miles from nowhere, you had to go back 3 weeks to the moment in Tucson when his informant had pressed a piece of paper into his hand, and the whole shape of the thing had become suddenly, terribly clear. Caleb Drum was not simply a thief. He was a man with a plan, and the plan had been running for months. Drum had spent the better part of 1882 building a network of contacts across the southern Arizona territory, identifying the routes that Army payroll shipments took, and systematically eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to his operation. The 6 dead men included 2 soldiers, a Wells Fargo courier, and those 2 ranch hands that Bernard had not known about until Mamie said the words mine. The stolen payroll was $40,000 in gold coin, intended for the garrison at Fort Lowell. It had been taken in a single, precise, brutal action 12 days ago, and Drum had vanished into the desert with it as completely as if the sand had swallowed him. Every conventional route south was being watched. Bernard had riders posted at the 4 main passes, had coordinated with the Army, had telegraphed every lawman between Tucson and the border. Drum was too smart to take any of those routes. Drum was going to go straight through the heart of the Sonora basin, through the most waterless, most brutal stretch of desert in the entire territory, because he would know that no sane man would follow him there. No sane man, and no man who did not have Mamie Ellsworth. Bernard had heard of her before he came looking for her. The Arizona territory was not a large community in the way that mattered, which was the community of people who knew the land well enough to make a living from it. And within that community, Mamie Ellsworth was something of a legend. She had come west from Ohio in 1876 at the age of 22 with a surveying kit, a gift for water finding that her grandmother had taught her, and a stubbornness that had apparently been a family trait for generations. She had spent 6 years learning the Sonora basin with a precision and dedication that had earned her the grudging respect of men who had been born in the territory and would have preferred not to respect a woman from Ohio. She found water. She found it in places where experienced desert hands swore there was none. She found it by reading the land in ways that she had tried on several occasions to explain, and that nobody had ever quite followed. She found it with the forked willow branch that she held between her palms, and she found it without the branch on the days when the branch was unnecessary, reading the desert the way a scholar reads a text, fluently and with confidence. She had also, in the 6 years since arriving, built a working cattle ranch on land that everyone had told her was too dry to support livestock, had sunk 3 wells that were all still producing, and had established herself as the person that miners and ranchers and surveyors came to when they needed to know where the water was. What the sheriff in Tucson had told Bernard, with the slightly apologetic air of a man relaying information he expected to be poorly received, was this: she's the only person alive who knows the deep route through the Sonora well enough to move horses through it in under 4 days. If Drum takes that route, and I believe he will, you cannot catch him without her. She knows the water sources. She knows the route. She knows the desert in there better than Drum does, and Drum's been running that territory for 2 years. Will she help? Bernard had asked. The sheriff had pulled on his mustache with the expression of a man calculating odds. She might. She's not friendly to strangers, and she is not friendly to being told what to do by men with badges or any other kind of authority. She has opinions about the federal government that she will share with you whether you want to hear them or not. But she is a woman of very strong principle, and if you go to her with the truth and treat her like the intelligent person she is, you might get somewhere. He had taken that advice and ridden 4 days to her door, and she had met him with those green eyes and that flat, assessing voice, and the terms she had laid down were not terms he had any choice but to accept. I agree to your terms, Bernard said. When can you ride? Mamie looked at the sky. It was the practiced, reading look of someone for whom the sky was a source of actual information rather than mere scenery. Tomorrow, before first light, the afternoon storms have been unpredictable this week. I want to be through the first section of the basin before the temperature peaks tomorrow. I need to reach Drum within 6 days, Bernard said. If he gets across the border, I know the timeline, Mamie said, with the patience again. I have been calculating the timeline since this morning. If Drum left when the evidence suggests, he has a 9-day start on us. The deep route through the Sonora, if we move correctly and the water holds where I expect it to hold, is 4 days. We will intercept him on the southern end of the basin, near the Agua Prieta ridgeline on day 4 or 5, before he reaches the border crossing at Naco. Bernard stared at her. You have already worked out the intercept point. I have been working it out since I heard about the robbery, Mamie said evenly. I knew someone would come eventually. I had hoped it would be before now. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite accusation but was adjacent to it. 6 men dead, 2 of them mine, and the federal government took 12 days to send someone to the only person in the territory who could actually stop this. Bernard did not have a good answer for that because she was right, and he had spent a fair amount of those 12 days fighting with bureaucratic inertia and jurisdictional squabbles that he was not proud of. I am sorry for the delay, he said, and he meant it plainly and without qualification. Mamie looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she was taking the measure of his sincerity and finding it, if not satisfying, at least acceptable. Water your horses from the trough around back, she said. You can sleep in the barn tonight. I will have provisions ready before dawn. It was not the warmest hospitality he had ever received, but it was the most honest, and Bernard Finley found, as he led his horse around the side of the adobe house, that he valued honest considerably more than warm. He lay awake in the barn for a long time that night, listening to the horses shift and breathe in the dark and thinking about Mamie Ellsworth. He thought about the way she had looked when she said, "Those are my dead," the absolute controlled stillness of her face around something that was clearly not stillness at all on the inside. He thought about the precise intelligence in her eyes when she had told him the intercept point, the sense of a mind that had been working this problem long before he arrived. He thought about the set of her shoulders and the way she had held the forked willow branch, and the voice that said what it meant and nothing extra. He admitted to himself in the dark of the barn, with the desert wind pushing through the gaps in the wood, in considerable danger of finding Mamie Ellsworth fascinating, and that was a complication he did not need on a federal manhunt with a 6-day timeline. He went to sleep and dreamed of nothing in particular. She woke him at 4 in the morning by opening the barn door, fully dressed and provisioned, 2 horses saddled, and a mule packed with water barrels and supplies. Bernard had slept in his clothes as a matter of habit and was upright and alert within seconds of the door opening, which Mamie noted with a small nod that he suspected was approval. "Biscuits and dried beef," she said, handing him a wrapped cloth parcel. "Eat while I explain the first section of the route." He ate while she talked, and he listened with the focused, total attention of a man who understood that what he was hearing was information that his life would depend on. Mamie spread a hand-drawn map on the top of a supply crate and walked him through it, naming water sources and landmarks and danger points with the fluency of absolute expertise. The map was remarkable. Bernard had seen survey maps of this territory, official ones produced by government expeditions at considerable expense, and they were vague and full of approximations where the Sonora Basin was concerned. Mamie's map was specific. It was dense with notation, marked with symbols that she explained as she went, annotated with observations about seasonal variation and underground water behavior that no survey map he had ever seen contained. "You drew this yourself," he said. "I surveyed it myself," she corrected. "Over 4 years. Every water source I have marked, I have confirmed by hand. Every route I have drawn, I have traveled. There is nothing on this map that I am guessing about." "Where did you learn to survey?" "My father was a surveyor," she said without looking up from the map. "He taught me to read land before I could read words. I was 9 years old when I ran my first transit line." She traced a route on the map with her finger, and the movement of her hand had a certainty to it that was different from most people's gestures, more like the movement of a physician examining a patient than like ordinary pointing. "Here is where we will stop at midday tomorrow. There is a rock seep here that most people miss because it is not visible from the surface. I found it 3 years ago and I have confirmed it twice since. The horses will need it." Bernard looked at the point she was indicating. It was in the middle of what appeared to be absolutely waterless open country, miles from any obvious geological feature that would suggest water. "How did you find a seep there?" Mamie looked up at him then, and there was something in her eyes that was almost like satisfaction, the look of a person who has been waiting to be asked the right question. "The plants," she said. "There is a specific variety of desert sage that grows in this region, only where the water table comes within 30 feet of the surface. It is very subtle. The plants are not dramatically different from the surrounding vegetation, but there is a slight difference in coloration, a very slight deepening of green, and they grow with a particular orientation to the prevailing underground water flow. You have to know to look for it, and you have to know what you are looking for." "And the willow branch," Bernard said. Mamie was quiet for a moment. "The branch is real," she said, in the tone of someone who had defended this statement before and found it tiresome. "I cannot tell you the mechanism. My grandmother could not tell me the mechanism either. But the branch responds to water, and my hands know what the response means, and I have found 17 wells with it that no one else could locate. The results speak for themselves." Bernard believed her without reservation, and it struck him that this was unusual, that he was not generally a man who gave belief easily or without evidence. But something about the comprehensive, detailed, entirely unsentimental way Mamie spoke about her skills made skepticism feel not just uncharitable but actively foolish. They rode out before the sun came up, into the darkness of the desert with a half-moon giving enough light to see by, and Mamie rode ahead without hesitation, navigating by starlight and memory and whatever internal compass she possessed. And Bernard followed and thought that he had never in his life been in a position where he was so thoroughly and competently led. The desert in the pre-dawn was a different country from the desert in daylight. The temperature was bearable, even pleasant, the sky an extraordinary depth of star-dense darkness that the light pollution of civilization never let you see. The only sounds were the horses' hooves on hard ground, the occasional distant cry of something wild, and the rhythmic soft sound of Mamie checking the mule's pack without breaking stride. "Tell me about Drum," she said after they had been riding for perhaps an hour. "Not what is on the wanted circulars. What is he actually like?" Bernard thought about it. "Smart, organized. He plans things far ahead and he does not improvise if he can help it. He is not cruel for the pleasure of it, which makes him more dangerous than the ones who are, because the ones who are cruel for pleasure are predictable. Drum is only violent when the calculation tells him it is necessary." The calculation told him that Tomas and Eli were necessary. Mamie's voice was flat and even in the darkness. "I believe they saw something they were not meant to see," Bernard said carefully. "Or they were in a position to report something to someone. Drum would have seen it as a problem requiring a solution. They were 2 ranch hands on a supply run," Mamie said. "Tomas had a wife and 3 children in the settlement at San Xavier. Eli was saving money to go back to Missouri to see his mother." She was quiet for a moment. "Drum solved them." The word "solved" with that meaning applied to 2 human beings was the most terrible thing Bernard had heard in a long time, and it was terrible precisely because of the quiet, precise way she said it, the way she refused to soften it. "Yes," Bernard said. "He did." "Then we will solve Drum," Mamie said, and that was all she said about it for a long time. They rode through the dawn and into the morning, and the desert lightened around them from black to gray to the blazing, impartial gold of full Arizona daylight, and the temperature rose with the methodical certainty of a punishment being administered. Bernard knew desert heat. He had ridden in it many times. But the Sonora Basin in September had its own particular quality, a focused, relentless intensity that seemed to press against you from all directions, and he understood viscerally why no one attempted to cross it without water intelligence. Mamie moved through it without apparent discomfort, which was not to say she was unaffected, but rather that she had made her peace with this landscape in a way that Bernard had not. She read it constantly, her eyes moving across the terrain with that scholar's attention, noting things that he could not distinguish from ordinary rocks and ordinary plants, but that she clearly saw as a text with specific content. At mid-morning she said, 3 degrees north of our current heading, and adjusted without waiting for his agreement, and he followed, and 20 minutes later she stopped at what appeared to Bernard to be an unremarkable stretch of rocky ground and dismounted. She took the dowsing rod from her pack. It was a simple thing, a forked branch of willow that had been smoothed and dried but was otherwise just wood. She held it in both hands with a particular grip, the fork pointing outward, and she walked in a slow, expanding spiral pattern across the rock ground, and Bernard watched her from horseback and did not say anything. He had meant to be skeptical. He was a federal officer of the law, a man of practical inclinations, not given to crediting folklore or mysticism. But watching Mamie walk that spiral, watching the absolute focus of her attention and the subtle, practiced readings she was making of some signal that he could not perceive, he found skepticism difficult to sustain. And then the branch moved. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a slow, definite rotation, the forked ends turning downward against Mamie's hands, and Mamie said here and stopped. She put the branch away, produced a folding-handled entrenching tool from the mule's pack, and began to clear away the surface rock at the indicated point. 2 feet down, water wept from a crack in the underlying stone. Not a gush, not a spring, but a seep, steady and cold and completely real, and Bernard climbed down from his horse and crouched over it with the honest astonishment of a man encountering something that has revised his understanding of the world. "Lord," he said quietly. Mamie was already arranging the horses, and the mule to drink from the shallow depression the seep was slowly filling. "The geology in this section runs a fracture line roughly nor-northwest," she said, not with the air of someone impressing him, but with the air of someone explaining the mechanism, because the mechanism was interesting. Water percolates down from the mountain range to the west during the summer rainy season and follows the fracture line at depth. At certain points the fracture comes close enough to the surface that you can access it if you know where to look, and the branch tells you where to look. "The branch confirms what the plants already suggest," she said. "I had identified this seep as probable before I took out the branch. The branch told me the precise point." Bernard looked at her. She was crouching beside the horses, checking the pack on the mule with those sure, economical movements, her copper hair tucked under a broad-brimmed hat that had seen considerable use, her face already showing the particular glow of sun on skin that had been in the desert all morning. She was entirely focused on the practical task at hand, and paid no attention to his looking, which somehow made him look longer. "How many water sources are there on this route?" he asked. 8 confirmed, 2 probable," she said. "We will need 7 to get through comfortably. If we need the probables, I am confident enough in both of them that I am not concerned." "And drum?" "He would know about some of these." "He would know about 3, Mamie said. "The ones that are geologically obvious. He would not know about the others because finding them requires either the kind of survey work I have done or the dowsing skill, and drum, whatever his qualities, is not a water reader. So he will have to ration heavily." "He will have to ration very carefully," she said. "And if he is carrying $40,000 in gold coin, his horses are carrying significant weight, which means his water requirements are higher than he might have planned for." She looked at Bernard directly for the first time in a while, and there was a particular sharpness in her green eyes. If we are where I calculate us to be relative to his timeline, he is running short of water right now. He will be looking at that ridgeline south of us and wondering how he is going to get through the next 2 days. That works in our favor, Bernard said. That works in our favor, she confirmed. A desperate man makes different decisions than a comfortable one. When Drum reaches the Agua Prieta ridgeline, he will be looking for water, not for a Marshal and a water Dowser. The word Dowser in her own mouth was dry and matter-of-fact, stripped of the superstitious connotations that other people gave it. It was simply what she was, a precise professional description, and Bernard found himself thinking that this was how she carried everything about herself, precisely and without apology. They ate midday camp in the shade of a rock formation that Mamie selected with the same careful purposefulness that characterized every decision she made. The shade was calculated for the angle of the afternoon sun. The position of the horses and mule relative to the rock was calculated for the wind, which would carry less heat from this direction in the afternoon. Bernard began to notice that nothing Mamie did was unconsidered, that she was continuously operating in an analytical mode that processed the desert environment as data and responded to it with optimized decisions. It was, he thought, a remarkable mind in action. He had met intelligent people. He had worked with skilled people. He had not often met someone in whom intelligence and practical skill were so completely fused, in whom the analytical and the physical existed in such seamless partnership. "How long have you been on your own out here?" he asked, and then regretted it slightly because it was a personal question that she had not invited. But Mamie looked at him across the small fire she had built for coffee with an expression that was considering rather than offended. 6 years, she said, since I came west. No family. My father died in 78, she said. My mother died in 69. I have a sister in Columbus who writes to me twice a year and thinks I have lost my mind. The corner of her mouth moved very slightly. She may have a point. You don't think so? I think I am exactly where I belong, doing exactly what I am suited to do, Mamie said. Whether that constitutes sense or madness is a question of perspective. She poured coffee into his tin cup with the steadiness of someone who had poured thousands of cups over campfires in all conditions. What about you? 6 years as a marshal. 9, he said. Family? No living family, Bernard said. He kept his voice even. It was old information, well-processed grief, the deaths of his parents during the war and a brother lost to fever in 71. But he noticed that Mamie received it with a quiet, straightforward acknowledgement that was different from the usual uncomfortable condolences he received when the subject came up. She simply nodded, as if she had filed the information and understood it, and asked nothing further, which was precisely the right response, and which he appreciated more than he could easily have explained. They rode through the afternoon in the way that people travel together in difficult circumstances, which is to say with a particular quality of silence, that is not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have agreed without words that what needs to be said will be said, and everything else can wait. Bernard found it comfortable in a way that surprised him. He was not generally a comfortable person to travel with. He had been told this. He had a tendency to push pace and defer rest, and maintain a focus on the objective that some people found oppressive. Mamie did not find it oppressive because she had her own version of the same quality, and they moved through the desert together with a kind of matched intensity that he thought probably looked, from the outside, like two people who had been working together for years. On the second day, riding south through a landscape that had simplified itself down to stone and light, and the occasional outpost of desert vegetation too tough to yield, Mamie said something that had clearly been in her mind for some time. The 2 ranch hands who were killed. The government will not pay their families anything. It was a statement, not a question, and Bernard knew it was true. Tomas and Eli had been private citizens, not federal employees, killed incidentally to a federal crime. There was no mechanism in the system of 1882 for compensating their families. The injustice of this was clear and uncomplicated, and he did not attempt to minimize it. "No," he said, "they will not. Tomas's wife has 3 children and the small wage from the ranch," Mamie said. "When I get back, I am going to make sure she has enough to keep the children fed and schooled until the oldest is old enough to work. That is a thing I can do." She paused. "Eli's mother in Missouri, that is harder. I can write to the garrison at Fort Lowell," Bernard said. "The payroll that was stolen is their payroll. There is sometimes a discretionary fund for civilian casualties connected to federal crimes. I will not promise that it will produce anything, but I will write the letter." Mamie looked at him. "You will actually do that?" "I will do it the day I return to Tucson," he said. "I give you my word on it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that evaluating look that had been directed at him from the beginning, and that he was beginning to recognize as something she could not quite help, a constant, automatic assessment of everything and everyone in her environment. Then she nodded once, and he had the sense that something had shifted slightly, that some provisional standing he had been assigned had been quietly upgraded. On the afternoon of the second day, something happened that Bernard Finley would remember for the rest of his life. They were crossing a section of the basin that Mamie had described as geologically complex, a place where several underground water systems interacted in ways that made the usual rules unreliable. She had been studying the terrain for the past hour with increased attention, the kind of focus that he had come to recognize as her processing mode, absorbing information from the landscape and running it through whatever internal analytic system she possessed. She stopped her horse so suddenly that Bernard pulled up hard to avoid riding into her. What he started, "Listen," she said. He listened. The desert was quiet in the way that the desert is quiet in the middle of the day, which is a relative quiet, full of small sounds, the wind, the insects, the distant creak of stone cooling. He heard nothing unusual. Not with your ears," Mamie said impatiently and swung down from her horse. She pulled the dowsing rod from her pack and stood still for a moment, and then she started walking, not in the careful spiral pattern she had used before but in a direct line, fast and certain, and Bernard followed on foot because something in her movement told him to. She stopped at a point on the ground that looked no different from any other point, crouched, and pressed her palm flat against the rock. She held it there. She closed her eyes. Bernard watched her and did not say anything. When she opened her eyes, they were bright with something that was not quite excitement but was close to it, the particular illumination of a person who has just confirmed something important. "There is a major water pocket 12 feet down," she said. "This is not on my map. I have never been to this exact section of the basin, but there is a significant underground cistern here, and it is full. How can you?" "The branch," she said, and held it up, and even as she held it he could see the faint tremor in it, the subtle response she was reading. "And the rock temperature. Do you feel this rock?" He crouched and pressed his own palm where hers had been. The rock was cool. In the middle of the afternoon desert with the sun hammering directly down, the rock should have been too hot to touch comfortably. It was cool. "The water below is keeping the rock temperature down," Mamie said, and her voice had the quality of someone thinking aloud while also explaining, the voice of a mind that could do 2 things at once. "This is a significant pocket, larger than anything else on this route." She looked at him, and the look had something in it that was personal and intense in a way that the preceding looks had not quite been. "This matters, Bernard, because if there is a major water pocket here, there may be a secondary route south that I have not surveyed, a route that would cut a full day off the approach to the Agua Prieta ridgeline." He had been thinking Bernard Finley, or Marshal, in the way you naturally think of your own name. The use of his first name, said directly with that green-eyed intensity, and that mind clearly sprinting ahead on 3 parallel tracks, produced in him a sensation that was entirely disproportionate and entirely involuntary. He looked at her crouching on that cool rock in the afternoon desert with her copper hair coming loose from the pin that held it and the dowsing rod trembling in her hands, and something rearranged itself in his chest in a way that he recognized and did not want to recognize. He was absolutely, thoroughly in danger, not from the desert and not from Caleb Drum. From this woman who was reading the earth with her hands and thinking 3 moves ahead and had just, without any apparent awareness of it, said his name. A day faster means we intercept Drum before he reaches the ridgeline, Bernard said, and his voice was steady, which he considered an achievement. If the secondary route holds water, Mamie said, I need to survey it as we go. It will require us to deviate from my mapped route and trust my real-time reading of the terrain. I trust your real-time reading of the terrain, Bernard said, and meant it without qualification. She looked at him again with that measuring look, and this time something in the measurement came out differently, and she looked away quickly in a way that was unlike her habitual directness, and Bernard thought, all right then. All right, they found the secondary route. It required Mamie to work her way south through completely unsurveyed territory, reading the desert in real time with the focused attention of someone performing surgery, making constant small corrections, stopping 3 times to confirm water sources with the dowsing rod, each time finding what she looked for. The confidence with which she did this was something Bernard had stopped trying to be skeptical of on the first day. By the 3rd day it was simply a fact of their world. The way that Mamie read the desert was a fact. The way that water was where she said it was a fact, and he navigated by it as naturally as he navigated by the sun. On the 3rd night they camped in a rock shelter that Mamie found with the same unerring directness she applied to everything, a natural formation that blocked the wind and retained the day's warmth against the nighttime cold, that the desert became so suddenly after sunset. They built a fire large enough to cook by, and sat on opposite sides of it in the comfortable proximity of people who have been in close quarters for 3 days, and have negotiated the terms of that proximity without ever quite discussing it. Mamie was cleaning her rifle. It was a Winchester 1873, well maintained with the careful attention she gave everything, and she worked on it with an efficiency that told Bernard she had been doing this for years and did not need to think about it. Bernard was looking at her hand-drawn map, studying the route she had marked for tomorrow, the approach to the Agua Prieta ridgeline, and the intercept point where she calculated they would find Drum. He will be at the secondary spring at the base of the ridgeline, Mamie said, without looking up from the rifle. There is only one spring on the south face that he will know about. He will stop there to water the horses before the final push to the border. How many men does he typically ride with? The robbery had 6 riders by the accounts I have heard, she said. 2 were wounded in the exchange with the Army courier detail. I do not know how severely. I can handle 6 men if the approach is right, Bernard said. Mamie looked up from the rifle then, and her look had the particular quality of someone deciding whether to say something. She said it. You are planning to confront them alone. I am the law, Bernard said. That is my job. Your job, Mamie said, does not require you to be dead about it. She set down the rifle. I can shoot, Bernard. I have been shooting since I was 12 years old, and I am accurate at distance. I am not asking to be in a gunfight. I am saying that if you ride into that camp with 6 armed men and 2 of them are wounded and therefore have nothing to lose, you are going to need someone watching your back. Bernard looked at her across the fire. The firelight was doing things to her face that were not fair, bringing out the copper in her hair and the sharpness of her cheekbones and the absolute, uncompromising directness of her green eyes, and he was aware that what he was feeling was not just professionally complicated but personally complicated in a way that he needed to manage carefully. I cannot put you in that kind of danger, he said. You cannot prevent me from being where I choose to be, Mamie said, with a quiet precision that made the statement completely accurate and somehow also generous, as if she was giving him the information not to argue but to establish the facts from which they could proceed. He looked at her for a long moment. You have already decided. I decided before we left my porch, she said. Those are my dead, and I intend to be present when the account is settled. She picked the rifle back up, and resumed her cleaning with the serene, purposeful calm of someone who has made their decision and moved on. Besides, 6-1 are not odds that I would choose for any person I am responsible for, and I am responsible for your survival on this route because no one else could get you here. He did not have an answer for that either. She had a gift for arguments that were simultaneously practical and personal and correct on all fronts, and he was beginning to think that arguing with Mamie Ellsworth was an activity that no one won, not because she was unreasonable, but because she was simply more right than her opposition. "All right," he said. "We go in together, but you stay behind cover at the ridgeline until I have made a lawful demand for surrender. If there is any response other than compliance, then you are free to be exactly where you are." Mamie nodded, and the nod had the quality of a contract accepted. Bernard looked back down at the map, and after a moment he said, quietly and without quite intending to, "I am glad you are here." The fire crackled. The desert settled around them in its nighttime sounds. Mamie did not look up from the rifle, but something in the line of her shoulders changed very slightly, softened by some amount that was small and entirely visible, and not at all inconsequential. "So am I," she said, and her voice was different from the daytime voice, from the practical and precise and professionally competent voice. It was quieter and more private and carried something that he thought was vulnerability, only Mamie Ellsworth's version of vulnerability, which was not soft and which did not diminish her in any way but which was real. He went asleep thinking about that voice. The fourth morning came with the same clarity that all the mornings in the deep desert had, a sky that was completely cloudless, and a temperature that would not stay reasonable for long, and a light that made the rock formations on the southern horizon look like they had been drawn by someone who had decided that merely geological accuracy was not enough. Mamie was up before him, which he was beginning to accept as simply the way of things. She was studying the southern horizon with the field glass she carried, her hat pushed back slightly, and when he came to stand beside her, she passed him the glass without preamble. "The secondary spring is at the base of that formation," she said, indicating a line of ridgeline 3 miles south. "There is a significant stand of cottonwood to the east of it that should not be there given the surface geology, which means the spring is larger than it shows on any map I have seen. And look at the northeast face of the formation." He looked. It took him a moment, but then he saw it, the faint smudge of smoke. Cold smoke, the residue of a died-down fire rather than an active one. A camp that had been there overnight. "They are there," he said. "They have been there since yesterday," Mamie said. "That smoke is from last night. They camped at the spring, which means they are as water-depleted as I calculated. They may stay most of today to let the horses recover." She took the glass back and looked again with the focused, processing expression that he had come to think of as her working face, the one that meant she was running calculations. "If they stay until afternoon, we can approach the ridgeline from the northwest and use the formation itself as cover. The spring is in a natural depression, which means anyone in the camp has limited sightlines to the northwest." "The northwest approach is uphill," Bernard said. "Yes. But it is also with the wind at our backs and the sun behind us when we arrive, if we time the approach for late morning." She looked at him. "They will be looking south, toward the border. The threat they anticipate comes from behind them, not from the direction they are traveling toward." It was tactically sound in a way that he had not fully worked out, and he was aware of a slight embarrassment at not having worked it out, followed by something warmer and more complicated, the pleasure of working with someone whose mind supplemented his own rather than competing with it. "Northwest approach," he said. "We leave the horses and the mule in the arroyo below the ridgeline and go in on foot from 200 yards. I will take the eastern anchor point here," she indicated the map, "behind the cottonwood line. You come in from the direct northwest. They will hear you before they see you, which gives you the moment of lawful demand you want. And if they do not comply—" She held up the Winchester with a look that was all the answer necessary. They rode the 3 miles in silence. the silence of people approaching something significant, and Bernard used the time to think about what he knew of Caleb Drum, and to prepare his mind for the variety of responses a man like Drum might have to an unexpected federal presence at his water source 3 days from the Mexican border. He thought through the scenario carefully, methodically, the way he had been trained and the way his 9 years had refined, and he found that the thinking was easier than usual because the tactical elements had been so cleanly arranged by Mamie that he could focus entirely on the human element. He was also, in a portion of his mind that he was not actively managing, aware that in a matter of hours this particular journey was going to end. They would resolve the situation at the spring, one way or another. Drum would be in custody or dead, the gold would be recovered, and Bernard would ride back to Tucson to file his report and write the letter to Fort Lowell and return to the machinery of federal law enforcement that waited for him. And Mamie Ellsworth would return to her adobe house 15 miles from nowhere, and her cattle and her surveys and her water and her solitary, competent, fiercely independent life. He did not care for how that felt when he thought about it directly. They left the horses and the mule in a wide arroyo below the ridgeline, tied securely in a spot of shade that Mamie selected. She checked her rifle one more time with the thoroughness of someone who believes in doing important things properly. Bernard checked his sidearm, a Colt single-action Army that had been his service weapon for 6 years, and which he trusted as much as he trusted any object. They looked at each other, and the look held a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Be careful," Bernard said, and it came out with more weight than the conventional words usually carried. Mamie looked at him with those green eyes and a directness that did not waver. "You too," she said, and turned and went east toward the Cottonwood line, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years alone in terrain that required you to be quiet. Bernard went northwest. The approach was 400 yards of slow, careful movement across broken ground, staying low, using the rock formations as cover, moving in the lateral shadows that the high morning sun cast off the ridgeline. He could hear the spring before he could see it, the small, precious sound of water in an otherwise silent desert, and he could smell the horses and the smoke residue of the dead fire. He got himself into position at the top of a flat rock shelf that looked down into the natural depression where the spring was. He had a clear view. There were 6 horses, as Mamie had estimated. There were 6 men, 3 sleeping, 2 eating, 1 sitting with his back against a rock with the quality of someone who was not well. The gold, presumably, was in the pair of substantial saddlebags on the horse that was tethered separately from the others, a large gray that was carrying something heavier than trail supplies. Caleb Drum was the man eating. Bernard recognized him from the description in the circular, mid-40s, heavy through the shoulders, dark beard, and the particular stillness of a man who was comfortable with violence in the way that certain predators are comfortable, not looking for it but not disturbed by its proximity either. Bernard stood up on the rock shelf. "Caleb Drum," he said, in the carrying voice that 9 years of federal work had given him, the voice that was loud and clear and carried absolute authority without requiring any additional volume to establish it. "United States Marshal, you and your men are under arrest for robbery and murder, hands where I can see them." The camp erupted. The 3 sleeping men came upright immediately, reaching for weapons that were not immediately at hand because they had been sleeping. The 2 eating men were on their feet in seconds. Drum himself was up and moving, not toward his weapon but sideways, a lateral movement toward the shelter of the rock wall at the south edge of the depression, which was exactly the right tactical response, which told Bernard everything he needed to know about how intelligent a problem Drum actually was. 2 of the men came up firing, shots that went wide because they were firing uphill from a standing start at a target in the sun, and Bernard returned fire once and took cover behind the rock shelf and shouted the surrender demand again and thought, Mamie, now would be good. Two things happened in rapid succession. One of the firing men took a shot from the east that disarmed him without, as far as Bernard could see, actually wounding him, the rifle spinning out of his hand in a way that indicated a very precise bullet impact on the weapon itself. The second shot from the east took the hat off the second firing man so comprehensively that the man froze in place and looked east with the expression of someone who has just received new and significant information about the quality of the threat they are facing. In the freezing of those two men, Bernard went over the rock shelf and down into the depression, calling the surrender demand a third time, and the situation resolved itself with remarkable speed once the mathematics became clear. 6 men, 1 wounded, 2 disarmed, a federal marshal in front of them, and from the east, whoever had just demonstrated that level of rifle accuracy. Drum did not surrender immediately. Drum was a man who calculated odds to the end, and he held his position against the south rock wall and looked at Bernard and said, with the level assessment of a man who was not done thinking yet, "I do not see any deputies, Marshal." "You do not need to," Bernard said. "Look at your men." Drum looked at his men. Then he looked east toward the cottonwood line, where the nature of the rifle work that had just occurred suggested someone very capable was positioned. Then he looked back at Bernard, and the calculation was visible on his face, playing out to its conclusion. Drum laid down his weapon. It took another 20 minutes to secure all 6 men with the rope from the mule's pack, which Mamie went and retrieved while Bernard held the position, moving through the camp with the efficient, unruffled manner of someone doing a practical task that needed doing. The wounded man she assessed with a matter-of-fact competence that surprised Drum's riders enough that they stopped their resentful muttering while she worked, tying a field dressing around a leg wound that had gone septic and explaining to the man in blunt, practical terms what he needed to do to avoid losing the limb when he reached a doctor. Drum watched all of this with the steady attention he apparently gave everything, and when Mamie had finished with the wounded man he looked at her and then at Bernard and said, with the tone of someone who has assembled a picture from its parts, "The water Dowser." "Yes," Mamie said. "I heard there was a woman who knew this basin," Drum said. He did not say it with any particular disrespect but with a genuine assessment. "I thought it was exaggerated." "Most things about what women can do are exaggerated in the wrong direction," Mamie said, and went back to checking the secure condition of the rope restraints with her characteristic brisk precision. Bernard looked at Drum sitting there with his hands bound and the gold recovered and the desert silent around them, and found that he had nothing he particularly wanted to say to the man, which was unusual in his experience. He had encountered criminals who needed speeches, who needed the full weight of the law laid on them verbally, whose own pride required engagement. Drum did not need that. Drum had run his calculation to the end and reached his conclusion and sat with it in the practical, rational way of a man who respects arithmetic even when it goes against him. The one thing Bernard said was, "Tomas Garcia and Eli Beaufort, 2 ranch hands, the San Xavier settlement." Drum met his eyes without flinching. "They saw the delivery point," he said. "If I had let them walk, the whole operation would have been over before it started." "It is over regardless," Bernard said. "With them dead." Drum had no answer for that. They made camp at the spring that night, which was necessary given the logistics of 6 prisoners, 3 horses that needed more water recovery before they could be pushed, and the simple fact that all of them, Bernard and Mamie included, had been in the desert for 4 days and could use the water. Mamie sat apart from the prisoners at the edge of the cottonwood line, looking south into the darkening desert in the direction of Mexico, and Bernard came and sat beside her after the prisoners were secured and the horses were seen to and the practical necessities of the camp were established. She was quiet for a long time. He sat with the quietness and did not try to fill it. "I thought I would feel differently," she said eventually. "When it was done." "How did you think you would feel?" "Resolved," she said. Complete, she was quiet again for a moment. "I feel it some, the resolution, but it is smaller than I expected. The dead are still dead, and catching the man who made them that way does not undo that. No, Bernard said. It never does, but it matters anyway. She looked at him. Does it to you, after 9 years of doing this? Yes, he said, and he meant it without reservation. It matters because justice matters, even when it comes late and even when it is incomplete. It matters because Tomas Garcia's wife can look at her children and tell them someday that the man responsible is in prison rather than riding free. It matters in the small ways because the large ways are not available. Mamie was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice was that quieter, private thing it had been by the fire 3 nights ago. You are a better man than I expected to find in a federal marshal. He felt that in a way that was completely out of proportion to the sentence. He looked at her, at the profile of her face in the last of the desert light, and he said, "You are not at all what I expected to find at the end of 4 days' riding." She turned to look at him then, and they were close in the way that sitting beside someone in the fading desert light makes you close, and her green eyes in the dimness had a softness that was entirely her own, that did not make her less fierce or less sharp, but added something alongside those things, something that he had been circling for 4 days. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone capable," he said. "Someone useful." Not someone who he stopped, because what he was about to say was significant and he was not certain of the ground. Not someone who what, she said, and her voice was not quite steady in a way that was somehow more courageous than steadiness would have been. Not someone I would not want to leave behind, he said. The desert was very quiet. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a night bird called once and went silent again. Mamie looked at him and he looked at her, and the 4 days of close travel and shared danger, and the particular kind of intimacy that comes from trusting someone with your life in a landscape that means business were all present between them. And then she said, quietly and with the same directness she brought to everything, "Then don't." Bernard Finley was not, as a rule, a man who acted on feeling rather than thought. He had a good mind, and he used it, and he did not generally let the landscape of his inner life override the practical requirements of the world. But sitting in the dark at the edge of a spring in the heart of the Sonora basin with Mamie Ellsworth looking at him with those green eyes and that directness, and having just said don't, he found that thought and feeling had arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously, and there was nothing to deliberate. He kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same quality that characterized everything she did, total focus and no apology, and the night bird called again in the cottonwoods, and the spring moved in its ancient, indifferent way, and the desert was dark and enormous around them, and entirely unconcerned with the two people at its edge discovering something that had been building since the moment he had ridden up to her porch. They rode back to Tucson with Drum and his men the following day, a longer route that Mamie selected for its access to water sufficient for so many horses, and the return journey had a completely different quality from the approach. There was still the practical focus, the navigational decisions, the management of the prisoners and the supplies and the terrain. But there was also conversation, real conversation, the kind that travels back and forth without agenda and discovers things. And 4 more days in the desert with Mamie Ellsworth discovering things was an experience that Bernard found himself cataloging as simply the best days he had passed in a very long time. She told him about Ohio, about the surveying work with her father in the green hills that had prepared her, without her knowing it, for a completely different landscape and a completely different life. She told him about arriving in the territory in 1876 with enough money for 6 months, and the conviction that water finding was a viable profession if she could only find the right geography for it, which the Sonora basin turned out to be. She told him about the first well she sank, on contract for a mining operation, which produced enough water to make the mine viable, and established her reputation firmly enough that the subsequent years had been steady work. She told him about the injustices she had encountered, the surveyors who would not hire her and then used her maps without credit, The ranchers who tried to pay her in goods rather than money because they believed women did not manage money. The Federal Survey Office in Tucson that had twice refused to incorporate her data into official maps before eventually, and without acknowledgement simply using it. She told him these things with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who has metabolized injustice into fuel rather than bitterness, who uses the anger to be more precise and more excellent rather than to simply be angry. Bernard told her about growing up in Pennsylvania before the war, about the brother who died of fever, and the parents who did not survive the aftermath of the war years, and the young man who had ended up in the territories in the early 1870s, looking for something to do with a kind of energy, and will that the settled East did not have room for. He told her about the 9 years as a marshal, the things he was proud of and the things he regretted, the corners of the work that were genuinely satisfying and the corners that were simply the machine grinding. She listened with the same quality of attention she gave the desert, total and engaged, and asked questions that were perceptive in the way that indicated she had been processing what he said in real time and following its implications. He found himself saying things to her that he had not said to anyone, not from a spirit of confession, but from the simple experience of talking to someone whose intelligence created a space where honest thought was the natural response. On the third day of the return journey, riding side by side through a section of the basin that she had surveyed and knew well, she said, without preamble, "I have thought about what you said. About not wanting to leave me behind." Bernard was careful, and I have thought about what that would look like, she said, practically, a marshal's life and what it requires, a ranch in the middle of the Sonora basin and what it requires. She looked straight ahead at the desert in the way she looked at problems. "I am not a woman who follows a man. I want to be direct with you about that." "I know that," Bernard said. "I have not for a single moment imagined that you were." She looked at him. "Then what do you imagine?" "I imagine," Bernard said carefully, thinking it through as he said it because he was working something out rather than reciting a prepared speech, "that two capable, independent people who happen to find each other extraordinary might work out an arrangement that honors both of those facts. I imagine that Tucson is not so far from your ranch. I imagine that the Arizona Territory has water problems that need solving and federal law problems that need solving, and that a woman who reads the desert like a text and a man with a federal badge might be of more use to each other than it would appear from the outside." He paused. "I imagine that I do not want to file my report in Tucson and ride away from you and spend the rest of my life wondering what I did not try hard enough to make work." The desert was wide and quiet around them. Mamie's horse kept its steady pace. Her face in profile was still and thinking. "You are not a man who says things he does not mean," she said finally. "I try not to be. And you understand that what I do is not a hobby or an eccentricity. It is my work and my purpose, and I will not give it up for any reason including you." "I would not ask you to," Bernard said, and the certainty in his voice surprised him slightly, which meant it was completely genuine. "The world is better with Mamie Ellsworth finding water in it. I have no interest in a version of you that does not do that." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he began to think he had miscalculated something, that the ground he had thought was solid was not. And then she said, quietly and with the particular courage that her voice had when it was saying something real, "My ranch has a second bedroom." Bernard looked at her. "Tucson is 2 days' ride," she continued, with the practical tone that she used when she was actually deciding something rather than speculating. "You could ride from the ranch to work your territory just as easily as from a boarding house in town. Possibly more easily, given that the southern section of your territory essentially begins at my property line." She met his eyes, and hers had that softness again, the one that lived alongside the fierceness and did not diminish it. "The second bedroom has a very good window. You can see the whole eastern sky." Bernard Finley had, in 34 years, never been proposed to by a woman who framed the proposal as a practical logistical arrangement with data points. He thought that it was probably the most honest and direct form of the question that had ever been put to him, and that the answer was simple. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the trail and he could see, just at the corner of her mouth, that she was smiling. Not the almost smile, not the ghost of something crossing her face. An actual smile, warm and real in hers, and it changed her face in a way that made the already extraordinary desert around them seem somewhat redundant in the business of providing beautiful things to look at. They delivered Drum and his riders to the Tucson jail 9 days after Bernard had first ridden up to Mamie's porch. The sheriff received the prisoners with the profoundly satisfied air of a man who had told someone something would work, and was now being proved correct. The gold was transferred to an Army escort for return to Fort Lowell. Bernard filed his report at the federal office, while Mamie attended to the business of replenishing her trail supplies and confirming the arrangements for her ranch during her extended absence, which were the tasks of practical people in the world. Bernard wrote the letter to Fort Lowell's commanding officer that same afternoon, the letter about Tomas Garcia and Eli Beaufort, and the discretionary fund for civilian casualties. He wrote it carefully, with the full weight of the case laid out and his own professional endorsement of the claim. He did not know if it would produce anything. He believed it would produce something, and he mailed it. He also went to a surveying supply house on Congress Street that afternoon and purchased a particular type of survey chain that Mamie had mentioned twice in passing on the trail, with the very slightly wistful voice that practical people use about tools they need and have not gotten around to acquiring. He had it wrapped and carried it back to where she was loading her resupplied mule in the yard of a merchant she knew, and he presented it with what he hoped was a casual air. She took it and looked at it and then looked at him, and the green eyes had something in them that was warm and bright and just slightly undone. "Bernard," she said. "You mentioned it," he said. She held the wrapped chain for a moment with both hands, with the same care she brought to the dowsing rod, and then she said, "Come home with me." And it was the most straightforward sentence and also the most significant one he had ever heard. The ride back to her ranch was the same country they had crossed with the prisoners, but with a completely different quality. Two people going somewhere rather than returning from somewhere. The desert in the late afternoon of September 1882, stretching west in colors that defied reasonable description, and doing it anyway. When they came up the rise and the low adobe house appeared ahead with the horses in the corral and the kitchen garden and the windmill that turned in the evening breeze and the big open sky over all of it, Mamie sat her horse and looked at her own home with an expression that he had not seen on her before, the expression of someone seeing something with new eyes. "It needs paint," she said. "The west wall particularly." "I can paint," Bernard said. She looked at him. "You are a United States Marshal." "Marshals can paint," he said. She shook her head in the way that meant she was not actually disagreeing, and they rode in. That autumn was the season in which Bernard Finley learned what it meant to live in the desert with a woman who read it like a language. He rode out of Tucson 3 and sometimes 4 days a week on the work of his territory, which was extensive and never quiet, and he returned to the adobe house and the woman and the kitchen garden and the horses with a steadiness and a sense of direction that he had not previously known he was missing. He watched Mamie work. He watched her take contracts from ranchers and miners and survey teams, watched her go out into the desert with her instruments and her branch and her extraordinary, trained eyes, and come back with information that transformed people's ability to function in this unforgiving country. He watched her negotiate for her fees with the same flat, direct competence she brought to everything, not asking for what she was owed, but simply stating it, and waiting with infinite patience for the other party to catch up. He also watched the reaction she received, and the casual dismissals, and the studied underestimations that men in the territory directed at her, not with malice in most cases, but with the unchallenged assumption that a woman alone in the desert with a forked stick was at best a curiosity, and at worst a liability. And he watched Mamie absorb those reactions, and redirect them without apparent effort, by the simple strategy of being so comprehensively correct about everything. She said that the assumptions could not sustain themselves in her presence. He told her one evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling dark with coffee, that he had seen a surveyor from the federal office dismiss her water location at a ranch in the San Pedro Valley and then find, when they dug at the point she had indicated, exactly what she had said they would find. "What did he say?" Mamie asked, with the interest of someone gathering data on human behavior. "Nothing," Bernard said. "He looked at the water coming up and he looked at you, and then he looked very carefully at the middle distance. That is generally what they do," she said, without particular bitterness. "He should have said he was wrong and thanked you." "Yes," Mamie said simply, "he should have." Bernard looked at her in the dark, the familiar face that he had come to know through the weeks of close living, the particular set of her features when she was thinking, the way she held her coffee cup, the small habitual movements that had become as readable to him as any text he had ever studied. "I want to say something," he said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you that what you do is extraordinary," he said. "Not useful or impressive or remarkable, extraordinary. The kind of thing that changes whether people survive in this country, and that you have done it largely without recognition or credit, and that it is wrong that you have had to do it that way, and that I am aware of what it has cost you to build what you have built here, and I am grateful that you let me be part of it." Mamie was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice had the quality he loved most, the one that was quiet and real and entirely hers. "That is the most words you have said at once since I have known you. I had a quantity to get through," he said. She reached over and took his hand in the dark, her hand that knew the desert and the instruments and the dowsing rod, and she held it with the same deliberate, certain care that she brought to everything. And they sat on the porch of the adobe house in the Arizona Territory in the autumn of 1882, and the sky was so full of stars that it seemed like an argument in favor of something. They married in February of 1883 in Tucson, in a small ceremony at the county clerk's office with the sheriff and two of Mamie's contracting clients as witnesses. It was not a grand affair, which suited both of them perfectly. Mamie wore a dress that was considerably cleaner and less sun-worn than her working clothes, but had not been selected for particular grandeur. And Bernard wore his good coat that he had brushed at the Tucson hotel, and they made the promises in the plain, legal words that the territory required. And when it was done, they were legally Bernard and Mamie Finley, and they rode back to the ranch. The letter from Fort Lowell arrived that March. The discretionary fund had approved a payment to Tomas Garcia's family and a contribution to a postal money order for Eli Beaufort's mother in Missouri. The amounts were not large. They were something. Mamie read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at Bernard with an expression that was complex and particular and real. "You said you would do it," she said. "I did it," he said. She came to him and put her arms around him in the way that she had come to do, directly and without ceremony, and he held her with the arms of a man who is very aware of what he is holding. And outside the window the desert morning was already building its daily argument about heat and light, and the complete indifference of the natural world to human concerns. And inside the adobe house, it mattered not at all. Caleb Drum was tried in the federal court in Tucson in April, and convicted on 6 counts of murder and 1 count of robbery of federal property. He received a sentence of life imprisonment at the territorial prison in Yuma, which Bernard witnessed, and which Mamie attended as well, sitting in the wooden gallery of the courtroom with her hands folded and her green eyes steady through the reading of the verdict. When it was over, she stood up and walked out of the courtroom and stood on the steps in the Tucson spring sunshine, and Bernard stood beside her. "Is it what you wanted?" he asked. "It is what was possible," she said. "Which is what I asked for." She took a breath of the warm spring air. "Tomas's wife came to me last week. She told me she is going to keep the children in school, all 3 of them. She has been offered work at the mission at San Xavier as a seamstress. She will be all right," She looked at Bernard. "You make things come out the way they are supposed to," she said. "Not always, but you keep trying in that direction. That matters." He thought that was possibly the finest thing she had ever said to him, which was notable given the quality of competition. The spring of 1883 brought new contracts for Mamie, a significant survey project for a railroad company that was laying preliminary lines south of Tucson and needed comprehensive water data for the route. It was the largest single contract she had received, and she spent 3 weeks in the field with a survey team, returning to the ranch on weekends with notebooks full of data and the particular energized quality of a person working at the full extent of their capabilities. Bernard covered his territory and came home and managed the ranch in her absence with a competence that surprised him slightly, discovering that the skills required were more adjacent to his existing skills than he would have guessed. He painted the west wall while she was gone. He repaired the corral fence. He learned the names of all the horses properly, which it turned out he had been avoiding because one of them was named Senator, and he felt the name required an expression of dignity from the animal that it was entirely failing to provide. When Mamie came back from the 3rd week of surveying, she found the west wall painted, the corral repaired, a pot of chili keeping warm on the stove, and Bernard on the porch with coffee, and she stood in the yard looking at the painted wall with an expression that was quietly, completely happy. In the late summer of 1883, they found out that Mamie was carrying their child. She received this information from the doctor in Tucson with the same practical equanimity she received most information, incorporating it into her calculations and adjusting her plans accordingly. She continued her survey work through the autumn with modified rigor, and Bernard continued his territory work with a low-level ambient worry that he managed by focusing on logistics and the things that were within his control, which he recognized as his habitual strategy and also as a limitation of it. He told her he worried, one evening in October, directly and without minimizing it. Mamie looked at him with the slight exasperation of a woman who is perfectly capable of assessing her own physical state and having it doubted by proximity of a concerned man, and then she looked at him with the more fundamental look that went underneath the exasperation and said, "I know you do. I also worry. These things can coexist with being fine." "They can," he agreed. "I am working on holding both." "Good," she said. "You can worry and also trust me to know my own body and my own limits. I have been in this body for 29 years and I am fairly well acquainted with it." "I do trust you," he said, "completely. I am working on the worrying part being proportionate." She patted his arm in the way that was affectionate and also slightly like someone patting a large, well-meaning dog. "You will manage," she said. Their son was born in April of 1884. He arrived with the particular insistence of a child who had decided on his schedule regardless of the plans of others, and he was healthy and loud, and had, from the first moment, an expression of absolute assessment and evaluation that Mamie said was entirely his own, and Bernard said was absolutely hers, and they both looked at the small face, and were more thoroughly undone than any previous experience in their lives had managed. They named him James Thomas Finley, the Thomas for Tomas Garcia, which was Mamie's choice and which Bernard accepted with the full understanding of what it meant to her and why. James Thomas grew up in the desert with a mother who could read it and a father who protected it, and the combination produced a childhood of remarkable education and considerable adventure, and a great deal of riding across country that most adults considered either impassable or uninviting, and that to him was simply home. By the time James Thomas was 3, Mamie had completed the railroad survey and received a second commission from the same company for a more extensive water study of the Southern Territories, a project that required significant travel and negotiation, and which she conducted with the comprehensive professionalism that had come to be her trademark, and which the railroad paid her the kind of rates that acknowledged the extraordinary value of what she was providing. The map she had drawn for the Sonora Basin transit was, by this point, being used by everyone who crossed it seriously. She had submitted it to the Territorial Survey Office, with her name on it this time, and they had accepted it, and it was the first formally credited survey publication in the territory under a woman's name. Bernard had held the published copy and looked at Mamie's name printed at the top, and felt a particular satisfaction that he did not try to describe precisely, but that was large and uncomplicated. The Fort Lowell garrison sent her a letter of commendation for the role she had played in recovering the payroll and capturing Drum. She read it once, commented that it had taken them 14 months to produce it, and put it on the shelf with her field notebooks, which was where she kept everything that mattered. Bernard was promoted in early 1885 to deputy marshal for the entire southern Arizona district, which was a significant appointment, and which came with additional territory and additional responsibility and additional everything. He discussed it with Mamie before accepting, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter from the federal office and the map of the territory and the arithmetic of what the appointment would require in terms of time and travel. "The ranch," he said. "The ranch is mine," she said with the absolute simplicity of a statement of fact. "It has always been mine and it will remain mine, and I will manage it as I have always managed it. That is not a concern." She looked at the map. "The additional territory takes you north more often, which means you are not here more often." She was quiet for a moment with the thinking look. "Is it something you want?" "Yes," he said honestly. "Then you should accept it," she said. "We will work out the logistics." She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, the touch that meant "I am with you on this. The ranch, the waterwork, James Thomas, these are the things I am tethered to. You are free to be the kind of marshal that the territory needs you to be. Those things can coexist." He accepted the appointment, and they worked out the logistics with the practical creativity that they had brought to the whole project of their lives together. The schedule adjustments, and the hired help, and the arrangements with neighbors, and the long weeks and the joyful returns, and the ongoing compromise and negotiation of two fully realized, independently capable people building a shared life, without either of them ceasing to be who they were. In the spring of 1886, their daughter was born, arriving in the early morning with considerably more composure than her brother had shown, and looking at the world from the first with an expression of reserved assessment that was entirely her mother's. They named her Clara, and she proved within her first year to have a startling aptitude for observation, sitting in the kitchen and watching Mamie work on her maps with a focus that Mamie described, with a mixture of amusement and recognition, as alarming. James Thomas, at 2, had opinions about Clara that evolved from wary assessment to enthusiastic endorsement within approximately a month, and the two of them together in the adobe house with its painted west wall and the kitchen garden and the desert beyond were a source of noise and motion and life that the house had clearly been waiting for all along. Mamie continued her work. The survey commissions grew, and the reputation solidified into something that operated almost independently of her by this point. The name Mamie Finley in the surveying and water-finding world carrying the weight of a record that could not be argued with. She trained 2 apprentices in the late 1880s, young women from the territory who had shown aptitude, and she trained them with the same comprehensive rigor her father had used with her, because the knowledge was too valuable and too hard-won to remain with only one person. Bernard built his career across the decade with the methodical, principled consistency of a man who knows what he is for. He dealt with cattle wars and mining disputes and the ongoing complicated misery of Apache policy, which he navigated with a respect for the humanity of every party involved that was not universal among federal officers of his era, and that produced occasional formal complaints from people who wanted compliance rather than justice. He held his ground on the latter every time it was tested, supported in this by a wife who had strong views about the difference and was never reluctant to articulate them. Caleb Drum died in Yuma prison in 1888, 5 years into his sentence, of pneumonia. Bernard noted it in his records. Mamie, when told, was quiet for a moment and then said, "I hope Tomas's children are well," which was a better response to the information than anything Bernard had prepared. They were. Mamie had remained in contact with the family at San Xavier in the practical way that characterized her care for people, checking in at intervals and providing assistance when it was needed in the direct, non-condescending manner that her particular form of generosity took. The 3 Garcia children grew up educated and capable, and the eldest, by 1888, was apprenticed to a carpenter in Tucson and earning his own wages. In the autumn of 1888, Bernard and Mamie rode together through the Sonora basin on a route that was mostly the secondary one she had discovered during the drum pursuit, now known and used and mapped, with water sources that she maintained and reported on annually. The children were with a neighbor family for the week. They rode through the desert as they had the first time, but all the ways it was different from the first time were the size and shape of everything that had happened between then and now, and the desert itself was unchanged, as indifferent and magnificent and honest as it had always been, and they moved through it with the ease of people who know the language. At the midpoint of the route, at the rock formation above the secondary spring that was not on any map when they first crossed here, Mamie stopped and pressed her palm flat against the rock in the way she had the first time. "Still there?" Bernard asked. "Still there," she said, and looked up at him with the green eyes that were 6 years more known and no less extraordinary. "The water table has actually risen slightly in this section since '82. The wet summers have recharged the system. You monitor it." "Every time I pass through." She stood up and brushed her hands on her trousers and looked at the ridgeline south of them, the same ridgeline, the same afternoon sky, the same smell of heat and stone and the particular mineral clarity of the Sonora air. "Do you know what I thought the first time you walked up to my porch? That I was another man come to take something from you," Bernard said. She looked at him with the slight surprise of someone who has been accurately read. "Yes," she said, "in some form." That is what most of them wanted: the map data, the well location, the route through the basin, the thing I had that they needed. "And I did need the thing you had," Bernard said. "Yes," Mamie said. "But you were the first one who needed the thing I had and also saw the person who had it." She said it without particular sentiment, in the way that she said things that were real, clearly and without ornamentation, because the thing itself was enough without decoration. Bernard looked at her in the afternoon light of the Sonora basin in 1888, the copper hair still copper, the green eyes still sharp, the face that the desert had made even more itself over the years, and thought that whatever else the work of his life had produced, this was the finest and most improbable thing. That a federal marshal had needed a route through the desert and found, at the end of his riding, someone who made the route and made the desert and made the whole complex, difficult, beautiful project of being in the world considerably more worth doing. "Come on," Mamie said, turning toward her horse with the particular energy of a woman who knows exactly where she is going. "There is a better campsite 2 miles south, and if we push we can reach it before the evening temperature drops." "Lead the way," Bernard said. She did, as she had from the beginning, with the forked branch and the surveyor's eye and the mind that read the land like a scholar reads a text, fluently and with complete confidence, and he followed, as he had from the beginning, with the respect and the love of a man who knows when he is in the presence of something remarkable and has the sense not to want to change it. The desert opened before them, wide and honest and indifferent to everything except the truth of what it was, and they rode south together through the gold and the heat and the ancient, patient silence of the Sonora basin, and the hoofbeats were the only sound for miles, and the sky was enormous, and the water was where she said it would be. It always was.